Gee, Ren, Pillsbury Doughboy. I wish you guys were real. Then I could have friends. Oh, hi. Welcome to Module 5, Lecture 11 for Introduction to International Relations. We're now transitioning away from foreign policy, and we're going to be talking about international conflict and terrorism. So what are the different types of war? First, there's what's known as a hegemonic war, which is a war over control of the entire world order. It's also called a general war, a world war, systemic war, and the last example of this was World War II. Another type of war is known as total war. It's known as total war because it involves one country trying to overtake and occupy territory in another country. And importantly, it involves marshaling the society of one's country to take part in the war effort, and it also signifies that anyone in the society of the opposing country would be a potential target. So it totalizes the impact in terms of who is relevant to the war efforts. And again, World War II is the most prominent total war that we've seen in the 20th century. Another kind of war is known as limited war, where military operations are underway to accomplish something of a small objective that does not involve the complete occupation of another country. So exemplified here by the photo from the war in Iraq in 1991. That's where the United States and Allied forces went into Iraq and, or rather went into Kuwait, pushed out Saddam Hussein, and then did not proceed to go into Iraq and take over the country. So that was a limited objective that was achieved by a coalition of forces across the world. Another form of war that you have probably heard of is civil war, in which you have two or more factions that are competing for control over a given territory, oftentimes with the desire to set up a brand new government. This is an image depicting the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, when the Hutus and Tutsis were engaged in a civil war with one another. And then lastly, there's another type of war that has been brought up in the media in the past couple decades, more frequently than perhaps some of the other types, and that is guerrilla warfare. And in guerrilla warfare, you're dealing with a couple of wrinkles that we don't necessarily experience in the other types of war, certainly not in the way that we consider a conventional total war. So in a guerrilla war, there's no established front lines. So if you think back to movies where you might have seen, one group of soldiers lined up on an end of a battlefield and another group of soldiers lined up on the other end, and then one of them gives a signal to their group, and then the other one kind of charges. That's not what happens in guerrilla warfare. So there aren't established front lines of engagement. And another aspect of this that's important to note is that people who are engaged, the guerrillas themselves who are engaged in this kind of warfare, oftentimes hide themselves among and get support from civilians. So it becomes even more difficult to identify who are the appropriate targets in a military conflict, because they may be people who are seeking shelter in a home, and so then it becomes a question of whether it would be ethical to, for example, bomb an apartment complex where you knew that there were insurgents hiding, because you might be killing lots of innocent bystanders. So it totally kind of throws a lot of the conventional ideas about warfare to the side, and it makes it much more difficult to identify who are the relevant actors that are engaging in this kind of conflict. Now, as to the causes of war, there are several which we're going to talk about here. First, we can examine this from the individual level. There may be individuals, exemplified here by, of course, Adolf Hitler, who have a tendency to want to pursue militaristic options to resolving conflict or pursuing some kind of goal through warfare. And so it's quite possible that in a society where a lot of the power, governmental power that is, has been vested in a single individual or small group of people, it's it's possible that those individuals are able to engage in and start war. But a lot of things have to be kind of knocked out of the way for those individuals to have that kind of capacity, right? In a democratic society, it's much more difficult for any one person or a small group of individuals to engage in war on their own because there's lots of checks and balances in place. So another cause of war could be identified at the domestic level. And the argument here is that there are some kinds of societies that may tend to be more conflict prone than others. In the past, writings had indicated that certain kinds of less civilized groups, for example, or people who are deemed more primitive are more likely to engage in warfare. But empirically, that hasn't necessarily shown to be the case. And we now think more in terms of different kinds of governmental regimes and whether, say, autocratic regimes are more likely to engage in war with other countries or democratic regimes are more likely. And remember, several lectures ago, we talked about the most important theory-like or iron-like law of international relations, which is known as the theory of democratic peace, which says that democracies are as likely to go to war or with authoritarian regimes, but they are less likely to go to war with other democratic regimes. Another idea about the causes of war stems from analyzing what's going on across states, not just within states. So here you can see a political cartoon that kind of suggests that the European Union is cuddling up to China and it sees this fuzzy, warm panda, but behind that veneer of a chubby bear is a ferocious dragon that it should be afraid of. And so the implication here is that the relationship between the EU and China could potentially be very conflictual. So this goes to highlight the fact that there are relationships, as we've talked about in the past, right, historical animus between countries or evolving and complex relationships between states that may make them more conflict prone in certain situations than perhaps in the past. And another final idea is that war is cyclical, that it happens in waves, and that sometimes we are in kind of a cycle of warfare, and other times we're in a trough. And so it depends on where we are historically speaking with respect to these cycles of warfare that dictate whether or not conflict is likely to emerge. And some of the theories that have been propounded include that there's sort of lots of wars that happen every 100 years or so. But in general, if we want to understand the propensity of war in the international system, we should look at the data. So here is a chart that talks about the incidence of armed conflict from the end of World War II up through 2011. And as you can see, it kind of reached a peak right at the conclusion of the Cold War. And ever since then, international conflict, armed conflicts between states have decreased precipitously since that time. So it looks like, again, if we're just looking at this one particular snapshot, that either perhaps war is on the wane in general, or we are now in the kind of doldrums of a low period of international conflict that's part of a larger cycle. We have to obviously keep examining the data to understand whether the former or the latter are the case. Wars can happen for lots of different reasons, and we're going to explore several of the reasons here, including ideas, because this is really important. You think about when people have conflicts, even when we're talking about politics with one another, right? You maybe talk to your friends or your parents or your neighbors or your dorm mates about your political views, and you realize that maybe you don't get along with that person, and it's not because they're not a good person, but because you have such a strong difference in the ideas that you hold very central to your identity. So we're going to look at several different kinds of ideas. One is nationalism. And so to give us a couple of working definitions that provide us with information about what this means, a nation is a population that shares an identity, usually including a language and culture. And this dovetails with the concept of self-determination, which is the right of a nation to form a state and to exercise sovereignty over its own affairs. And so where we tend to see conflicts in the world, occasionally they arise as a result of nationalistic tendencies. And by that I mean that there's one group that either wants to exert greater freedom, that's currently feeling like it's being oppressed by the existing power structures, or the majority groups, or even a minority group that might be in power, and they are together unified by common language, common culture, so they constitute a nation. And then they decide that it is within their rights as a nation under international law to seek autonomy and to govern themselves. And so this sense of nationalism may animate additional concerns about the likelihood of conflict emerging where the rights of those individual groups are being oppressed or not respected by dominant groups in a society. Another example of a conflict over ideas can be spurred by ethnic conflict. So an ethnic group is a large group of people who share ancestral, language, cultural, or religious ties and a common identity. And so there's lots of different ways you can cut this, but these groups are bound by these kinds of traits. And sometimes they confront or even exemplify ethnocentrism, which is a tendency to see one's own group in favorable terms and to view the outgroup in unfavorable terms. And again, going back to psychology, there's lots of work from group theory that talks about these sorts of dynamics, that it's possible as a way to preserve the integrity of our small family units or tribes or villages from when man was in antiquity. We had a tendency to view with skepticism outside groups because it helped to preserve the security of our small groups and prepare us for potential conflict with outsiders. And so this may be an inborn quality that humans have developed over history in order to secure themselves and the ones that they identify with. And so I have a small cartoon here, which you may or may not be able to see, so I'll read it, but it kind of typifies somewhat of an ethnic disparity between kind of an in-group and an out-group. And so this is more geographically designed than it is relating to ancestry, language, culture, or religion, but in any case, it sort of illustrates the point of this in-group, out-group effect. So there's one person at the top who says, "Since I'm only back for a little, I have to spend my time in California wisely. We have to go to Trader Joe's. They don't have them in Colorado." And then the person in the second frame says, "They don't have Trader Joe's in Colorado?" And then the third frame says, "Yeah, no Jamba Juice either." And the person then concocts this idea of the United States separating California from the rest of it, and the little narrative there below California says, "Land of tasty food." And then the entire rest of the United States is marked by the word wasteland. And having lived in California for 7 years myself, I can tell you that because in part California is so large, there's a tendency to see other states as not nearly as important or significant, certainly not as good, if we're talking about weather, than the state of California. So a lot of Californians may harbor those kinds of views, although that's not to say that all of them do, but it kind of highlights this idea that, what's good for our group, what we privilege about ourselves, we look to other groups and shun them because they don't share the same values, or we view ourselves as being more significant than those other groups. And then finally, religious conflict, which has obviously been talked a lot about in the news with all that's been going on in the Middle East and in North Africa. And so religious conflict, it can be spurred by fundamentalism, among other things. And so fundamentalism refers to strict adherence to religious practices. And I've put a little graphic here that has Osama bin Laden and 5 kind of features of fundamentalism so that you can get a sense of how that differs from just regular religiosity. And it includes factors like being able to divide the world purely along good and evil lines with really no gray area, paranoia, so a feeling of deep suspicion or anger towards those who are on the opposite side of what you feel is the true religious belief system, an apocalyptic orientation, so this desire to obsess over the end of times, end of humanity, and to go forth and try and actually achieve the goal of reaching that endpoint. Charismatic leadership, a commitment or devotion to a charismatic leader, so someone who inspires others to act alongside them. It's often accompanied by a cult of leadership, so everyone kind of devoting themselves to one person who sometimes might identify with God or with deities. And then finally, a totalized conversion experience. And this is once the fundamentalist converts or embraces the ideology, they do so completely. So they might change their name, they might change their clothing, they might cut off family members. They completely wrap themselves around the idea that this religion is now a stand-in for who they are as a person and what they want to achieve in life. So this degree of fundamentalism can lead to conflict because the perspective of someone who is a fundamentalist is so, again, kind of white or black, right or wrong, that it makes it easy to identify other people as being in the wrong, and therefore it can include discussions about whether the fundamentalist group needs to take on some kind of concerted action to root out people who are not pure in their views or anyone who does not share their views at all. So fundamentalism can be a spark that leads to conflict. And finally, ideological conflict. So here you have Khrushchev and Kennedy arm wrestling over the fate of the world. And this is the idea that the world during the Cold War was split not based on something like religious differences or ethnic differences, because there were many Americans who have Russian backgrounds, and it's not directly for nationalistic reasons, but it was about ideology, right? It was about this idea that communism and capitalism and democracy were diametrically opposed to one another, and so there had to be this kind of all-out tussle for control of the world. And this is how the world was split, as we saw from several lectures ago when I showed you the map that had the different countries that were allied with the United States and the countries that were allied during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And it really created kind of rift. There was really only just about one or two kinds of camps you could be in, with a few notable detractors who either were third parties or decided to be part of what was called the non-aligned movement. And so ideology, our views of how we should run society, even if they may not be on their face violent in nature, they can cause conflict where both societies feel that they are in the right, and there's a desire on the behalf of either society to completely change the rest of the world in the vision that they have based on what they view is the correct ideology to advance. Okay, other kinds of reasons why you might have conflict. You might have a dispute over territory. This is in part related to where boundaries or borders are drawn. There are lots of examples of this through history, but one example of this might be the northern border of Chile and Peru. There also may be disputes over control of entire states within existing borders. And this is oftentimes where we see things like civil wars emerge in places like Angola, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua. There are wars of secession, where an existing entity within a state that maybe does not have full autonomy tries to withdraw or remove itself from an existing state. And we've seen this in the cases of Kosovo and most recently South Sudan. Economic reasons can also foment conflict. And this economic conflict is the most common form of conflict in international relations. This relates to something we're going to get into when we talk more about the international political economy and theories related to that. But one of those theories is called mercantilism. And this is a practice in which trade and foreign economic policies were used specifically to help build up a country's military. And so where we see, and this is most common during the colonial times, but where we see countries trying to acquire new territory primarily to enrich themselves so that they can enlarge their military forces and seek out new territory, that can certainly cause conflict because other countries may have the same designs, and we have a limited world here, so there's going to be a kind of land grab that occurs between countries that are vying for supremacy in the international system. Another related concept is lateral pressure, which is where the economic growth of states, it is argued, leads to their necessary geographic expansion because they need natural resources beyond their borders, especially if we're talking about places that have not been blessed with plentiful natural resources. If you think about, for example, Great Britain, right, it's not terribly surprising that it would become a very strong colonial force because we're talking about a relatively small island nation that does not have the same kind of wealth of natural resources that you find in places like sub-Saharan Africa. So it stands to reason that as their economy increases, in order to keep their economy afloat and to, in fact, expand upon it, they would need to seek out other resources from elsewhere that they can use to continue the rapid pace of economic growth. And so we're going to conclude here by discussing something at the domestic level, which is military doctrine. And in particular, we're going to look at the essential elements of military doctrines that we've seen over the past, say, 15 years or so. So during the first Bush administration, you have the Powell Doctrine, named after General Colin Powell. And the main elements of the Powell Doctrine included massive firepower, putting lots of boots on the ground, and clear objectives that the military is trying to achieve. But as you might suspect, that by putting lots of soldiers out there and committing a lot of resources to developing weapon systems, this can be very expensive. And so this is something, the United States spends more money on its military than every other industrialized country in the world combined. So if the United States ever undergoes, and it has indeed undergone, economic troubles, occasionally there's a need to revisit an approach that has a kind of blank check given over to the armed forces because maybe there is less money to go around, or we can be more efficient in the way that we do spend money. So the Powell Doctrine was kind of lost some of its favor because it tended to be very expensive. This was followed up during the Bush II administration with the Rumsfeld Doctrine. And here, this merges high-tech firepower and special forces with only a minimal use of our Army and Marines. And it shifts away some of the burden on the voluntary military force and relies instead on private contractors, which also animates other kinds of important considerations. So some of the drawbacks, lack of sustained power, because if you're only relying on these very small groups, then you're not necessarily going to be able to, say, maintain control of a given territory for a really long period of time because you simply don't have the boots on the ground like perhaps you might under the Powell Doctrine. And it also brings to mind some ethical and legal concerns, right? So what are the responsibilities of private contractors? Are they also bound by international law in the way that official government military actors are? So the international community has had to wrangle with this as we've seen a transition toward the use of greater number of private contractors because they play by different rules, and in some places, they can be hired and represent lots of different countries. So it's even unclear to whom they are actually directly responsible in terms of legal issues, in terms of the moral and ethical considerations as well. So the Rumsfeld Doctrine tried to minimize the use of force, but in doing so, it put additional emphasis on the use of private actors, and that brought up new kinds of concerns. This was followed by General Petraeus' doctrine, which kind of reverts in some way back to the Powell Doctrine, but is a little bit different because while it does include boots on the ground, it's not nearly to the extent that the Powell Doctrine required, relied more on intelligence, and therefore was less expensive because you're not having to worry about the massive training or emphasis on high technology that you have in the Rumsfeld Doctrine. But one of the problems associated with the Petraeus Doctrine was that the locals, the people who were being affected by the deployments of boots on the ground, right, got tired of being occupied, and this kind of generated additional unrest in places that the United States was trying to enable them to take on a more favorable view of American military force. So this created its own set of concerns, even though it was less expensive than some of the other options. And then more recently, we have what might be called the Obama Doctrine over the course of President Obama's administration. And Obama's doctrine focused highly on using counterterrorism measures, like the Petraeus Doctrine. It also relied on intelligence, but it also, kind of like going back to the Rumsfeld Doctrine, relied a lot on the use of technology in targeted killing. In particular, you probably heard a lot about the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, which are used to take out particular targets. But the drawbacks to the Obama Doctrine include that, especially with respect to drones, the use of these kinds of new technology to target specific citizens with specific objectives in mind may skirt international law. And there's certainly ethical concerns associated with separating the soldier from the battlefield and having someone in a remote location using a remote control kill someone from a distance. And then also there's bureaucratic bloat in that the amount of individuals that it takes to kind of have an emphasis on intelligence and the use of this new kind of technology increases the size of government, perhaps makes it less efficient. The chains of command get more complicated. So all of these are kinds of drawbacks to the current doctrine that's underway. And if you're interested, I encourage you to watch the film if you want to understand more about how the Obama doctrine has played out. The film from the 60 Minutes episode on the killing of bin Laden, which really helps you to understand what it looks like to implement the Obama doctrine and the results, the perhaps ability of the doctrine to accomplish its goals on the one hand, but then on the other hand, also some of the issues that arise through this particular kind of doctrine that are things that were worthy of consideration as we move to a new presidency where we'll have probably a different kind of doctrine and different emphasis on what's important for military engagement in the United States.